The story goes that before Jimmy Doolittle's 16 bombers lifted off the deck of USS Hornet on the morning of April 18, 1942, his crews stripped them down to bare bones. They pulled the defensive guns and replaced them with broomsticks painted black. The planes were too heavy, the mission too desperate. So they flew to Tokyo carrying painted wood where the weapons should have been. That's the version most people know. It's half true, which is the most dangerous kind of wrong. The broomsticks were real, painted matte black and installed in the tail cone of each B-25B at the Mid-Continent Airlines Modification Center in Minneapolis, Minnesota. But they didn't replace guns that had been there before. The B-25B didn't have a tail gun position. The tail cone was already empty. What the broomsticks replaced was nothing. What actually came off those 16 aircraft was the Bendix ventral belly turret, the retractable ball mount underneath the fuselage, housing twin .50 caliber machine guns. That came off for a documented reason: weight and range. The mission required nearly doubling the fuel load. A standard B-25B carried 646 gallons. The Tokyo Raid aircraft needed 1,141 gallons, achieved through a 265-gallon bomb bay tank, a 160-gallon collapsible rubber bladder on top of the bay, and additional cells in the crawl space. Carrying that much fuel, something structural had to go. The belly turret went. The top turret stayed. Twin .50 caliber guns in a Bendix power-operated mount, fully functional, flew over Tokyo. The .30 caliber nose gun stayed. The B-25Bs that hit Japan weren't unarmed. They were deliberately lightened for an unprecedented mission profile. Carrier launch, a one-way strike of 650 miles, landing in China. And the trade-off was specific and considered. The broomsticks in the tail cone were theatrical. Their purpose was to give Japanese interceptors the visual impression from a distance of a tail gun position with real defensive capability. Crews were bluffing, not surrendering. The B-25B's belly turret had also earned a particular reputation in general service for being extraordinarily difficult to operate. Crews who worked with it found the learning curve steep enough that its elimination from the Tokyo aircraft, while driven by practical rationale, drew no complaints. The confusion between they replaced their guns with broomsticks and the actual sequence, belly turret out for weight, broomsticks added to an already bare tail as deception, real guns remaining on top, tells us something about how compressed history becomes. It also tells us something about the B-25's actual story, because the aircraft that supposedly flew to Tokyo stripped bare went on to become the most heavily armed aircraft in the U.S. Army Air Force's entire inventory. The path from that baseline to that endpoint is a story about what happens when you give determined men in a desperate theatre the tools and the latitude to solve their own problems. North American Aviation's NA-62 first flew as a production aircraft in August 1940. The Army designated it B-25 Mitchell, the name a tribute to Brigadier General William "Billy" Mitchell, the air power prophet court-martialed for saying exactly what eventually turned out to be true. The aircraft that carried his name was a competent twin-engine medium bomber, two Wright R-2600 Cyclone radials, standard bomb load of 3,000 pounds, crew of 4 to 6. The design intent was straightforward: fly to a fixed target at medium or high altitude, release bombs with precision, return to base. Against fixed targets, the formula worked well enough. Against Japanese shipping in the Southwest Pacific in 1942, it didn't work at all. Medium and high-altitude bombing against ships on the move achieved a documented hit rate of 3.3%. A destroyer moving at 20 knots with 30 seconds of warning from a bomb that takes that long to fall from 10,000 feet is already somewhere other than where the bombardier aimed. The physics were working against the doctrine before the first bomb was ever dropped. The Army Air Forces knew the numbers. The crews knew them more viscerally. They flew the missions, watched their bombs miss, and came home with the specific frustration of having risked their lives to achieve almost nothing. Lieutenant Travis Hoover, who flew the second aircraft in the Doolittle formation, described falling in love with the B-25. Lieutenant Ted Lawson, whose plane was the seventh off the deck and who lost a leg in the crash landing in China, spoke of it in glowing terms. Fast, hard-hitting, built for a fight. Their affection for the aircraft was genuine. But affection doesn't solve a 3.3% hit rate against moving targets. That required something more drastic. Paul Irvin Gunn was born on October 18, 1899, in Quitman, Arkansas, the son of a blacksmith named Nathaniel Hezekiah Gunn. He enlisted in the U.S. Navy in 1918 during the final months of World War I, serving initially as an aviation mechanist's mate. He re-enlisted in 1923 and was selected as a naval aviation pilot, the enlisted aviator program that identified mechanics with the aptitude and composure to become pilots without going through the officer commissioning process. He flew in the Top Hat Fighter Squadron, VF-1B, and served as a flight instructor at Naval Air Station Pensacola. After 21 years of service, he retired from the Navy as Chief Petty Officer in December 1939. He went to the Philippines almost immediately, hired by businessman Andres Soriano as personal pilot, and quickly became chief pilot and operations manager of Philippine Airlines. The fleet was 4 Beech 18s, painted red, his wife Clara's favourite colour. Everyone called her Polly. They had 4 children, 2 sons, Paul and Nathan, 2 daughters, Connie and Julie. By the late 1930s, the Gunn family was established in Manila the way expatriate professionals establish themselves. Houses, routines, schools, the kind of rootedness that takes years to develop and moments to destroy. On December 7th, 1941, none of that held. Gunn was commissioned as a captain in the Army Air Corps at the war's start and immediately redirected his Philippine Airlines aircraft to evacuation and supply work. In one documented mission, the one that earned him the Distinguished Flying Cross, he flew medical supplies into Bataan in an unarmed airplane into hostile airspace under active fire. Before any modification had been made, before any field innovation had begun, Gunn had already demonstrated what he was prepared to fly into when the people on the ground needed something only he could bring them. But he couldn't bring his family out. Japanese forces occupied Manila. On January 20th, 1942, his wife Clara and their 4 children were interned at the University of Santo Tomas. They would remain there until February 1945. Nearly 3 years within a few miles of where the Pacific War was being fought, held by the people Gunn was now working in every available hour to kill. Every modification that followed, every gun he bolted in, every nose section he converted, every hour in a depot working without authorization was done by a man who knew exactly where his family was and couldn't reach them. That's not background texture. That is the engine of the story. Gunn arrived in Australia with the disorganized remnant of American forces that escaped the fall of the Philippines. He had credentials: retired naval aviation pilot, commissioned army officer, experienced aircraft operations manager. And he was in a theatre that was severely short of everything except problems. The combination meant he had access without close supervision, which is the specific condition that tends to produce exactly the kind of innovation he was about to create. In August 1942, he turned his attention to the A-20 Havocs on the flight line of the 3rd Attack Group. The A-20 was a fast, twin-engine light bomber in the same general category as the B-25, built for medium-altitude bombing with defensive armament. Gunn looked at the aircraft's nose and saw something the designers hadn't put there: space for fixed, forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns. He installed them. Without formal authorization, working with available materials, Gunn retrofitted .50 caliber guns into the A-20's nose, aimed straight ahead, controlled by the pilot. On September 12, 1942, those modified A-20s flew a raid against the Japanese airfield at Buna. The results were sufficient to end the institutional debate about whether the concept was viable. General George C. Kenney, commanding the 5th Air Force, learned what Gunn was doing and responded not by shutting it down, but by placing Gunn directly onto his personal staff as Special Projects Officer. That phrase sounds bureaucratically neutral. In practice, it meant that Kenney had recognized an engineer moving faster than the institutional pipeline and given him the formal cover to keep moving. Kenney was a particular kind of military leader. He had flown 75 combat missions as a fighter pilot in World War I. He spent 1940 in France as a military observer and returned having concluded that American military aviation was falling behind the German Air Force. Air and Space Forces magazine described him as a Renaissance airman: engineer, flyer, logistician, tactician, strategist, and exceptional leader. What he did with Gunn wasn't sentiment, it was recognition of a result. The institutional sequence matters precisely, and the academic record is careful about it. A 2013 thesis from the Air University at Maxwell Air Force Base, formerly titled Mitchell's Over the Pacific: The Dynamics of B-25 Innovation, states the sequence directly. The initial A-20 and B-25 modifications were accomplished at the squadron level. Kenney and Whitehead facilitated them by encouraging these efforts. The modifications came first. The general's support came second. Kenney didn't create the innovation. He created the environment where it could survive long enough to prove itself. After the Doolittle Raid validated the A-20 concept, Kenney ordered the modification program extended to B-25 Mitchell bombers. He then had to persuade his own pilots that the new attack doctrine was sound. That required active effort. Kenney had to convince his pilots to operate the modified aircraft in new ways. The hardware was ahead of the crew's confidence in it. What Gunn did to the B-25 began with the nose. The standard B-25 had a transparent plexiglass nose cone, the bombardier's station, designed for high-altitude precision bombing. Gunn removed it. In its place went a solid metal nose section carrying fixed, forward-firing .50 caliber machine guns pointed straight ahead, no traverse, all pilot-controlled via buttons on the control wheel alongside the bomb release. The bombardier's station went with the glass. The aircraft stopped being configured for high-altitude precision work and became an attack platform that also carried bombs. Then, more guns. Cheek-mounted .50 caliber packs on the fuselage sides, angled to fire forward. The fuselage required structural reinforcement around the gun mounts to manage recoil forces from multiple, simultaneous .50 caliber weapons. Additional bracing between the fuselage and engine nacelles, structural members in the nose section. That work happened at field depots by mechanics who identified what was failing and addressed it without waiting for an engineering directive from California. The B-25C and D models were the transitional variants during this period. 2.50 caliber guns in the nose, one fixed and one flexible. Upgraded Wright R2600-13 engines. They were the aircraft the crews were flying while the modification culture was developing. A first-person account from a B-25C pilot who flew in 1942 and 1943 describes his aircraft specifically as a modified B-25C for low-level bombing and strafing. The modification a field status, not a factory designation, indicating the aircraft had been altered at unit level from its delivery configuration. These modifications spread through squadrons informally. Best practices moved through crew conversations and depot mechanics, the way knowledge moves when the formal documentation channel is too slow for the situation. Skip bombing arrived in the Pacific from a different direction than gun, and the attribution matters. The concept had British origins. Major William Benn of the 63rd Bomb Squadron, 43rd Bomb Group, began running skip bombing experiments with B-17 Flying Fortresses in the fall of 1942, and the first American combat use of the technique happened on October 23, 1942. Not a B-25, but a B-17. Benn's crews developed the approach through trial and paid for some of that knowledge in casualties. Gunn's contribution was recognizing the B-25 as the superior platform for the technique and building the weapon that made it devastating. The B-17 was large, comparatively slow in the low-altitude regime, and too valuable to commit in the numbers needed. The B-25 was twin-engine, more agile, more expendable, and already configured with forward-firing guns that could suppress defensive fire throughout the approach. The B-25 pilot could strafe the target's deck crew while still inbound, keeping anti-aircraft gunners from establishing a steady aim. A B-17 couldn't do that to the same effect. The technique at the technical level. Fly in at 200 to 250 feet altitude, 200 to 250 miles per hour. Release bombs at approximately 300 yards from the target. The bombs skip across the water surface like stones, detonating on the ship's side or submerging to explode adjacent to the hull. Delayed action fuses of 4 to 5 seconds gave the aircraft time to clear the explosion before detonation. Standard ordnance was 500-pound or 1,000-pound bombs, 2 to 4 per run. Pilots trained on the wreck of the SS Prout, a 4,700-ton steamer that had run aground on Nateara Reef near Port Moresby in January 1924 and was still sitting there. It was an imperfect training target. It didn't shoot back. But it gave crews the physical pattern of the technique before they applied it against targets that were actively trying to kill them. By the end of February 1943, the 3rd Attack Group's B-25 crews were proficient. The timing was close. A Japanese convoy was already moving through the Bismarck Sea. The convoy left Rabaul on February 28, 1943. 8 transports carrying approximately 7,000 reinforcement troops for the garrison at Lae, New Guinea, escorted by 8 destroyers. 16 ships. Allied air forces had been tracking it for days. On the morning of March 3, 1943, 12 modified B-25s from the 3rd Attack Group, alongside a dozen A-20 Havocs, with high-altitude B-17 working at 8,000 feet to divide Japanese fighter and anti-aircraft attention, and P-38 and P-40 escorts managing the fighter threat above, hit the convoy at mast height. Kenny's memoir records the opening directly. The battle was opened by 12 of Pappy Gunn's modified B-25 bombers. In the first 15 minutes, those 12 aircraft skip-bombed and sank 4 cargo vessels and 2 destroyers. The morning attacks expended 17,500 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition. That afternoon, 8 B-25s scored 10 direct hits out of 24 bombs dropped. By March 5th, all 8 transports and 4 of the 8 destroyers were on the bottom. Admiral Samuel Eliot Morrison, whose multi-volume history of American naval operations in World War II remains the standard reference, characterized the Battle of the Bismarck Sea as the most devastating attack of the war by airplanes against ships. The forward guns were doing specific tactical work throughout every approach. Before each bomb run, the B-25's .50 caliber machine guns swept the target ship's deck, suppressing anti-aircraft crews, penetrating deck plating, keeping Japanese gunners from establishing aim on the low-flying bombers long enough to disrupt the attack. The strafing ammunition ran in a deliberate repeating mix: 2 armor-piercing rounds, 2 incendiary, 1 tracer, designed to penetrate and ignite simultaneously. The guns weren't bonus firepower, they were the mechanism that made the bomb run survivable. The comparison that closes the argument. Medium and high-altitude bombing against ships achieved a 3.3% hit rate. Skip bombing by trained crews in modified aircraft achieved a 90% strike rate, according to a 1945 Army Air Force Technical Intelligence report. The improvement wasn't incremental. It was a 27-fold difference in effectiveness, produced not by a new aircraft or a weapons program, but by modifications that happened at the field level before anyone in Washington had formally approved them. The Bismarck Sea settled the institutional argument. After March 1943, nobody in the 5th Air Force was debating whether Gunn's approach worked. North American aviation answered the Bismarck Sea validation with the B-25G, accepted by the Army Air Forces in May 1943. The G variant took the field modification concept and went considerably further than anything the crews in the depots had attempted. The transparent bombardier's nose was gone, replaced by a solid nose section shortened by 26 inches. That shortening was necessary to accommodate a 75mm M4 cannon. This weapon was categorically different from the .50 caliber machine guns Gunn had been bolting into nose sections. The M4 cannon weighed 893 pounds. It measured 110 inches in length, just over 9 feet. The bore diameter was 3 inches. It loaded manually, 1 round at a time, from a 21-round magazine. The shells were the same ammunition used in the M3 Lee tank. North American had applied the field modification philosophy, put more firepower in the nose, and pushed it to its most aggressive possible interpretation. The B-25G also carried 2 fixed .50 caliber machine guns alongside the cannon in the nose, plus the standard top turret armament. 463 aircraft were built in this configuration. The 75mm cannon's operational record requires honesty, because the dramatic specifications didn't fully match the combat results. In the summer of 1943, cannon-equipped B-25s attacked 2 Japanese destroyers in one documented engagement. One destroyer was struck by 5 rounds. 5 direct hits from a 3-inch cannon, with no sinking effect. The destroyers were manoeuvring at speed, the cannon loaded slowly, and the recoil produced considerable handling problems for pilots. After approximately 5 months of operational service, many of the cannons were removed from field aircraft and replaced with additional .50 caliber machine guns. This is the honest account of the 75mm cannon, and it strengthens the larger story rather than complicating it. The crews that had driven the modification Escalation through field trial and error recognized when an approach wasn't working and changed course without waiting for institutional permission. The cannon was the dramatic overreach, the moment the Escalation pushed further than the mission required, and the response was the same pragmatic iteration that had built the modification culture in the first place. The B-25H arrived in August 1943 with those lessons absorbed. The cannon stayed, a lighter version, but the nose guns doubled from 2 to 4.50 caliber weapons. Add the cheek-mounted blister gun packs on the fuselage sides, the waist guns, and the tail turret guns, and the total forward-firing firepower in the H configuration reached 8.50 caliber machine guns firing simultaneously on the approach run. 700 aircraft received this configuration. One 12-aircraft B-25H squadron in full armament carried more .50 caliber machine guns than 4 complete infantry regiments combined. That figure came from wartime analysis, not retrospective approximation, and it explains why Japanese shipping losses to low-level B-25 attack became as severe as they did across 1943 and 1944. The B-25J arrived in December 1943 as the final and most produced variant, integrating what had been proven across all preceding models. It restored the co-pilot position and offered both the bombardier-equipped glass nose for conventional work and the solid nose configuration with multiple forward-firing guns for the strafing role. The Air University thesis on B-25 innovation, drawing from factory documentation, states that the B-25J could strafe with up to 14 machine guns on its approach run. The Army's official assessment: preferred due to increased firepower, improved bomb run stability, and superior to all other similar aircraft for armament. The Marine Corps flew their version as the PBJ-1, the Navy procurement designation placing B-25 series aircraft in Marine operation. 16 Marine squadrons received PBJ-1 variants. 9 flew combat missions. They began at Sterling Island in March 1944 and flew through the invasions of Saipan in June 1944 and Iwo Jima in February 1945. The Marines lost 26 aircraft in combat and 19 more in non-combat incidents. Their crews flew the same heavily modified aircraft against the same targets at the same low-altitude exposure as the Army Air Force's crews who had developed the doctrine alongside them. The aircraft that North American aviation delivered in August 1940 had become, through field-driven escalation and factory catch-up, the most heavily armed platform in the Army Air Force's inventory. The innovation that produced it, in the precise language of the Air University thesis, was bottom-up. One distinction needs to be stated plainly before leaving the armament story behind. The B-25, in its final Pacific configurations, was a straight-line attack aircraft. The pilot aimed the forward guns by pointing the aircraft's nose. On the attack run, flying directly at the target, every forward-firing weapon discharged into a fixed point ahead. Pull out, turn for another pass, silence until the next approach. The attack profile was linear in every operational sense. Ingress, fire, egress, repeat. The AC-130 Spectre gunship, which became combat famous in Vietnam and has operated in every American conflict since, works on an entirely different geometric principle. The AC-130 orbits its target in a continuous left-handed bank, firing side-mounted weapons, in its current configurations a 105mm howitzer, a 40mm Bofors cannon, a 25mm Gatling gun, continuously into a fixed point on the ground below. The aircraft circles. The guns fire sideways. The target receives sustained fire from a platform that isn't exposing itself to frontal attack. That's not a strafing run. It's a sustained siege from above.
These tactical concepts are unrelated, despite both fitting loosely under the category of armed fixed-wing aircraft attacking surface targets. The side-firing orbiting gunship concept developed in Vietnam, beginning with the AC-47, the converted Douglas C-47 transport that crews called Puff the Magic Dragon, progressing through the AC-119 Stinger and maturing into the AC-130. The B-25's legacy runs through close air support philosophy and attack aviation doctrine broadly. The direct mechanical and doctrinal lineage of the AC-130 runs through a different branch entirely. The B-25 demonstrated definitively that a twin-engine bomber could carry devastating forward-firing armament, operate at low altitude, and achieve hit rates against surface targets that high-altitude bombing couldn't approach. That demonstration influenced attack aviation. But the specific orbiting gunship concept the AC-130 represents came later and grew from different roots. The B-25's actual legacy doesn't need the embellishment. What happened at the Bismarck Sea on March 3, 1943, speaks well enough on its own. After the battle, Kenney sent Gunn to the North American Aviation Factory in Inglewood, California. This was the precise moment when the field modification became sanctioned production. The man who had started by bolting .50 caliber guns into A-20 nose sections without authorization was now on the factory floor with formal authority over the production specifications of the variant the Army Air Forces was ordering. The Air University thesis holds a photograph from this period. Lieutenant Colonel Paul I. Gunn, standing alongside James H. Dutch Kindleberger, North American's president and chief designer, the West Virginia-born World War I aviator who had designed the B-25, the P-51 Mustang, and the AT-6 trainer. The rogue field engineer and the factory architect, standing together at the Inglewood plant, over the aircraft they had each shaped from entirely different positions in the institutional hierarchy. The bottom-up innovation had completed its circuit. Crews modified aircraft at the squadron level. Kenney recognized and protected the innovators. The battlefield validated the concept. The factory codified the lessons. Top-down doctrine caught up to what airmen in depots had figured out under combat conditions, working nights with what was available. Gunn's service continued in increasingly senior roles until late 1944, when a Japanese bombing attack on Leyte wounded him severely enough that he was removed from active warfare. He spent the remainder of the war stateside. He retired from the Army on June 30, 1948, as a full colonel, medically, due to physical disability from wounds sustained in combat. He collected a Distinguished Flying Cross, a Silver Star, a Legion of Merit, an Air Medal, and 9 Purple Hearts over the course of his service. Clara and the 4 children were liberated from the University of Santo Tomas in February 1945. 3 years and 2 weeks after their internment. There is a photograph in the Air University thesis showing the family together in a Brisbane hospital. The thesis provides a caption. No caption is actually adequate. After the war, Gunn re-established Philippine Airlines. He went back to the islands where his family had been held, where the modifications had been developed, where the war had been fought, and flew commercial routes.
Beech 18s, the same type he had been flying before any of it started. On October 11, 1957, a chartered Beech 18 crashed in a storm over the central Philippines. He was 57 years old.
He was buried at Barrancas National Cemetery, Naval Air Station, Pensacola, the same installation where, decades earlier, he had learned to fly as an enlisted naval aviation pilot and served as a flight instructor. The Warfare History Network's assessment, published in its retrospective on the B-25, called him one of the true characters of World War II and one of the most important. The Air University thesis more plainly identifies the bottom-up innovations of Major Paul the Pappy Gunn as the defining driver of the B-25's transformation from medium bomber to flying arsenal. The aircraft North American Aviation designed in 1939 and delivered in August 1940 carried 3.30 caliber guns and a single .50 caliber tail gun. Nearly 10,000 of them were produced before the war ended. The Army Air Forces accepted 9,816 B-25s across all variants. They flew in every combat theatre: the Mediterranean, the Pacific, Burma, North Africa, Europe, China. The British flew them. The Soviets received them under Lend-Lease. The Dutch flew them in the Pacific. The Canadians flew them. The Marines flew their PBJ-1 variants into Saipan and Iwo Jima. Not all of those aircraft were the heavily modified Pacific strafers. The Mediterranean theatre B-25 story is different. Higher altitude operations, different targets, different tactical requirements. The transformation this script has been describing is a Pacific story specifically, because that's where the conditions existed. A theatre that was a secondary priority for American resources in 1942. Crews working through a doctrine that wasn't delivering results. And one particular man from Arkansas who refused to wait for the manual to be written. The men who flew the modified aircraft were young. Most B-25 crews in the Pacific in 1943 were in their early to mid-20s. They practiced skip bombing on a rusting shipwreck on a Pacific reef, and then flew the same technique against actual Japanese destroyers, with actual anti-aircraft guns and actual fighters trying to intercept them. The twin Wright Cyclone engines sat in nacelles almost directly adjacent to crew positions. Veterans described the noise as a physical presence, a constant vibration that became the ambient condition of the job. At mast height, 200 feet above the Bismarck Sea, a B-25 was moving fast in an aircraft that veterans described as handling like a bus at that altitude. One pilot's account: either you're speeding at treetop level in a plane that handles like a bus and being shot at, or you're getting shot at by a ton of very big guns. There was no third option. Some of those crews came home. Some didn't. Some came home and spoke about what they'd done for the rest of their lives. Some didn't speak of it for decades, and then did. Once, to a child who eventually became a grandparent themselves. And in that way, these stories moved forward through time in ways that archives don't fully capture. If your grandfather flew a B-25, any variant, any theatre, any year of the war, put his name in the comments. If he flew the glass nose version over North Africa or Italy, if he flew the solid nose configuration in the Pacific at 200 feet over Japanese shipping, if he flew PBJ-1s with the Marine Corps at Saipan or Iwo Jima, if he was the crew chief who kept Pappy Gunn's modifications flying through another sortie, his name belongs in this record. The people who built the weapon were one set. The people who flew it were another. The people who maintained it at field depots,
who reinforced the gun mounts, who figured out what the 75mm cannon was and wasn't capable of, and said so clearly enough that it got replaced. They're in the story too.
This is where those names go. The comment section is the record. Put them there. Subscribe for more stories like this one.